Hello, welcome back. I am continuing on with the last section of Robert A. Johnson's book, Inner Work. Been working on this book for quite some time, so thank you for those who've watched so far and stuck along with it, those who've joined at any point herein, anyone who's reached out and made recommendations to look at some of his other works, like He, She, and We. Where he talks about like the divine, not divine, but the masculine psychology, maybe divine, and feminine psychology, and then the psychology of romantic love. Those both come highly, or all three of those books rather, come highly recommended. So if you were interested in any of this, which I have found each section to be highly relevant and actually really helpful in this book, and his body of work was probably equally as impressive. So definitely check out more of his stuff. Alright, so let's get started. I'm not going to finish this, it's super long, but we can make a dent. So here we go. Levels. It is surprising what a wide range of needs are served by active imagination once you begin to adapt it to your life. At one time, it may help you to resolve practical everyday conflicts, such as which school to send the children to, or how to spend your money. At another time, you may live out the mythical journey you have stored up within you. At the far end of the spectrum, active imagination becomes a mystical religious experience. I find that the varieties of active imagination fall into three basic levels, depending on the use that is made of it. Number 1, horse trading. Number 2, embracing the unconscious. Number 3, experiencing the spiritual dimension. That's the last one, number 3, experiencing the spiritual dimension. Horse trading, as I call it, is the most practical, personal level. It is the use of imagination when you need to negotiate with your inner personalities to make those compromises and trade-offs that are sometimes required to keep practical life functioning. If horse trading seems a rather undignified name for this use of active imagination, it is because it is a somewhat undignified activity. It is a blatant process of bargaining with the inner parts of oneself so that some agreements can be reached and life can proceed. Embracing the unconscious is the level at which we actively try to bring up the undiscovered parts of ourselves from the unconscious so that we can integrate them into our conscious functioning. It is the level at which we are trying to become acquainted with the unknown inner parts of ourselves. Most of the examples we have given so far are from this level. It is the primary function of active imagination and the purpose most people have in mind when they begin. Experiencing the spiritual dimension is the level at which one is seized by a deep experience of the great archetypes. The active imagination is perceived as a vision and gives rise to religious insight. This is a rather uncommon form of active imagination, but it is experienced by many individuals and therefore it is good to be aware of it. So now we're going to the first section describing horse trading, which is making kind of a blatant bargaining agreement with the unconscious. Horse trading is the most practical, down-to-earth use you can make of active imagination. It begins with recognizing that you are made up of many parts, that each part of you has its own needs, its own life to live, and wants to participate in your conscious life. When you truly see this, you also begin to realize that many of the seemingly insoluble conflicts that irritate you within your day-to-day life are actually simple arguments between different parts of yourself who don't happen to see things alike. Sometimes when you can't arrive at a synthesis between the two parts that are arguing inside you, when you can't transcend the conflict, it becomes a matter of interior negotiations. You have to work out some kind of compromise. Sometimes people are put off by this approach to active imagination. It feels too sordid or mundane to use this high art to work out a compromise between the part of you that wants to get your work done and the part that wants to go to parties every night. But the practical fact is that there are times when the only way you can keep functioning is by doing some good, honest horse trading. At least it sets up a communication between the different parts of yourself who haven't been speaking, and eventually that communication leads to a synthesis. Communication leads to a synthesis. if we just keep on being irritated with our day-to-day things, and like he's talking about, the part of you that wants to get your work done and the part of you that wants to go party, it's like if you just kind of shut down, like we said, compartmentalizing or fragmentalizing, there's so many versions of that word, making a fragmented part of yourself by shutting off an aspect and then only embracing one wholeheartedly and thinking that you can do that for long. It doesn't ever last. It's something, eventually it pushes up to the surface because it's a part of you and it wants to be explored. You might not have to go all in the other way, but just kind of like hear it out, I guess, start that dialogue. Horse trade, as we're learning, leads to a synthesis. When I first became an analytical psychologist, I often had to work in the evening. Many of my patients worked during the day and could only come in the evening or on weekends. It was not a bad schedule, since I had my days free, but for some reason I resented it bitterly. Some inner part of me was used to having my evenings free for me, for visiting friends, socializing, music, personal life. This childish part of me was furious, and the unconscious, irrational resentment found its way into my practical life. I was irritable toward my patients. I almost forgot appointments. These are the kinds of things that happen when someone in the unconscious is absolutely opposed to what the ego has set up. I took this problem to active imagination. I looked for that part of me that was angry at my work schedule. The image that came up was a spoiled adolescent. He said, "No, I will not work in the evening. That is feeling time, that is fun time, that is human being time, that is not work time, and that is final." So I set up a long conversation with him. I explained and explained. Look, we have to make a living, we have to earn money, or both of us will be out on the street and hungry, you included. Since we are just starting in the profession, the only patients we have at this time are those who come in the evening or on weekends. That is the practical necessity. It has to be done. At first he wouldn't budge. I said, "Look, we have to pay the rent." And he said, "I don't give a damn about the rent. I just want to have fun, and that's what I'm going to do." I said, "But I do care about the rent." And he said, "That's tough. You go worry about that." I said, "I can't work and earn a living if you are going to sabotage everything and make me moody and resentful all the time. It affects the patients. I forget things. I put appointments in the wrong places." All of this was true. There was a general chaos because such a large part of me was in rebellion against my work. Finally, I got this fellow by the throat, in my imagination, of course, and up against the wall, and I said, "You have got to listen or we are in bad trouble. Now what kind of a deal can we make?" So the following horse trade developed. He agreed that if I would go to a drive-in at 10 o'clock every night and have a nice meal and take him to a movie a couple times a week after the patients were gone, then he would keep off my back the rest of the time and let me work in peace with my patients. For many months it worked that way. As long as I gave him his meal out and an occasional movie, he was happy and he let me work. But if I missed one evening of our meal out, this juvenile would be irritable the next day. He would make me resentful and forgetful in my work. It was incredible to me that this character had so much power over my moods and my functioning, but he did. I never admitted until many years later that I had been forced to make such a sordid, mercantile, backroom deal with my self-indulgent inner child. I felt like Faust making a pact with the devil. But in retrospect, I have come to respect these kinds of dialogues, these negotiations, these compromises between warring factions. In some ways, they are more humanly pertinent than the elevated conversations with gods and archangels. They keep the fabric of human life intact, and sometimes they lead to a consciousness that is all the more profound because it is human, earthy, and immediate. The next section is called Embracing the Unconscious, and it's a little longer, so I will stop and probably start a new video. I think these only record for like 20 minutes. But just going back really quickly, this part's extremely self-explanatory and makes a lot of sense, but the section here where he's talking about how he was in rebellion against his own self, how far do you go in rebellion against something just because you need to make a point? Well, and you see here that he was just only hurting himself. So even though these are dialogues and conflicts within your own self, you can see that how they play out in your actual day-to-day. He was taking it out on his patients, that they were there at a certain time because his inner self was saying, hey, you're taking time away from what I'm supposed to be doing, which is my practical thing that I need to do, it must be done. Even though he enjoys the work or seeing the patients, or sometimes, you know, going out to the movies and whatever it may be, you just rebel so deeply against this part of life. But it's not about that. It's sometimes you can do this even though it seems kind of sordid, like he says, and you're just making a deal with yourself, or how he sees it as a deal with the devil. It's just kind of finding a way to balance out so that you don't burn out, or that you don't get stuck in a rut, essentially. So that's kind of a common motif of this work. So I'm going to stop it right here and get back with embracing the unconscious. 2 seconds.